Chapter 1101. Fear. Temporal Lock Point, Gold, Gateway Treasure. Exchange 10,000 F-grade gold ether stones to set temporal lock on a region. Durability, 998. Silas stared at the treasure, his mind still racing. Temporal lock point wasn't capable of changing the flow of time in a region. Instead, what it could do was force two timelines to work in unison with one another. Whenever Silas stepped off of Earth in the past, he would find himself suffering because Earth's timeline and that of the outside world had been misaligned. It was thanks to this treasure that he had been able to go to the level 30 bazaar and change everything. Ironically enough, as much as he hated his experience at the bazaar the first time, it was responsible for maybe the greatest boost to his growth in the shortest period of time. Unfortunately, temporal lock point wasn't the magic bullet answer to all of his problems. If Earth had still been under its time warp, what Silas could have done was return and set the lock point in reverse, locking this region to Earth and thus taking advantage of Earth's time warp to accelerate time around him and gain extra moments to reach D grade. This would have saved him from having to make a trip to Earth, which would have been especially difficult considering there were no superhighways to Earth right now for obvious reasons. Still, such a path would have come with its own difficulties, since Silas would have to learn how to build a teleportation point between here and Earth for any of that to work. Well, he wouldn't need a full teleportation pad, just something capable of linking the spatial nodes of this place and Earth. But all of those complexities were irrelevant since Silas was once again suffering from success. He had successfully broken Earth out of its caged cycle, so there was no longer a time warp to take advantage of in this case. That said, wasn't there another? His hibernation realm. Wasn't the hibernation realm capable of accelerating the healing of his contracts by a ridiculous margin? The percentages were so exaggerated at this point that they had left the trillions behind by a substantial margin. Unfortunately, that had its own problems. Silas had already confirmed with Nosfaline, when she had entered the hibernation realm to complete her mesmerics trials, that the hibernation realm didn't work on time. At the very least, it didn't heal based on accelerating time around his contracts. This made sense, though. And it was probably better this way. If his contracts were aging at over 500 trillion% every time they entered the hibernation realm, they'd be dead before Silas could even benefit from them. But as Silas' connection with his hibernation realm increased, and his comprehension of runes and how things worked likewise deepened, his understanding became one layer deeper. His conclusion was simple. It was impossible for the hibernation realm to accelerate healing so much without some aspect of time being involved. The difference was that it was a much more clever usage, one that could help to rapidly heal wounds and accelerate evolution without actually impacting the lifespan of his contract. The reason Silas was so certain of this was because, after the evolution to his profession, his progenitor flame abilities had begun to influence it, and by extension, he could feel it doing the reverse. His sensitivity to the mesh of reality was especially sharp now, so he could feel those subtleties, and he realized that if he could tap into just a little bit of the time-warping capabilities of his hibernation realm, just the tiniest bit, even if it was a mere fraction of a fraction of a fraction, then wouldn't he gain all the time he needed? When Silas had this thought, he knew that he would be able to succeed. The thought alone was enough to guarantee it. The confidence he had in himself was only growing by the day. Not that he needed much more to begin with. He stood around the dungeon for a full extra hour before he began to move. Runes danced, not just from his hibernation realm, nor was it just temporal lock point either, but even the dungeon itself. Silas realized that he would need some of the D-grade runes here to stabilize the structure of what he was trying to create for long enough for this to succeed. Was he about to destroy another top-tier treasure right after losing the world scepter? In all likelihood, yes. But he needed more strength and power, and he needed it now. He fused with Nosfaline, and the world released a sigh of relief, as though finally free to allow Silas to control its runes. The D-grade runes, which had just been unruly, obediently fell into his palms, and swiftly afterward, they formed one barrier after another. Silas realized as he worked that there was much more potential he could pull out of his hibernation realm if given enough time. This just might be the path he needed to make the prowess of temporal delay and astral stutter even more powerful. Right now, his two progenitor flame abilities were both gold, and yet he didn't quite understand what this meant or what sort of power they had. If his hibernation realm could become less of a hidden place to store his beasts, and more like a hidden weapon that followed him around everywhere he went, what would that mean? What if his hibernation realm could become a domain of sorts, one that could both heal him and be used to crush enemies? What if his hibernation realm could even help him to extend his combat matrix index to his contracts as well? How powerful would they grow? Silas trembled, and he felt his rune spark mastery progress just the slightest bit. But he was so focused on the task at hand that he hardly spared it the attention. In a trance, Silas completed one step after another, and even after he succeeded, he didn't show the slightest joy. He simply pulled out the obelisk and stepped into it. When he stepped out, he was spent, but he only gobbled up a large amount of food before stepping in again. Every time Silas left the jade, facing off against the obelisks, his aura became sharper and more refined, and the runes of the world seemed to hum to his tune all the more. And then, almost 6 months later, he stepped out again. Having well and completely changed. The world didn't hum to his tune any longer. It fell into a silence. One bred by fear. Chapter 1102. A chance. Silas looked down at his hands, feeling that a great deal had changed about him, and yet, nothing at all. The concept of a higher race grade just felt so odd to him. After progressing to E grade, the change had been quite substantial, but it wasn't easily reflected in any way one might expect. Now, it was more of the same. His stats felt like they hadn't changed at all, but his power. He flicked a finger, and there seemed to be a snap in the air. His body thrummed like a well-oiled engine, everything about him working in unison to grant him power he couldn't have imagined before. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human Simioid D. It was truly an intoxicating power, but along with it, runes began to swirl around Silas en masse, forming meshes of energy around him, layering in such deep and complex forms that it almost didn't feel like he was summoning runes at all, but instead a different sort of armor. The world was just so obedient. Silas realized then, more than ever, just how much your starting position mattered. He was a rune spark master, he had been for a while now, and yet it had never felt more substantial than it did now. That was both exhilarating and frustrating in its own way. Because he was a D-grade race with the favor of this world, the runes were more pliable and receptive to him, almost as though acknowledging that he was someone to be obeyed and respected. It didn't care that his original merit was worthy enough. Unless he had noble enough status for it, it would never care. Silas took a breath and then slowly exhaled. There was no use in growing frustrated by this. He had now squeezed all the potential out of the obelisks that he could, and they were now useless to him, at least on a personal level. There was, of course, nothing stopping him from allowing others to use them if they could take the constant refinement. Near the end, he had to really push to get the sort of change he wanted. Unless one was willing to suffer, reaching D grade was impossible. Is the vessel ready? Silas asked Nosfaline. It is. I managed to find one, and it's in decent shape. But it's not as good as the Thriskai vessel. That's fine. I expected as much already. When Silas destroyed the vessel to lure them in, he knew this was likely to happen. But he had his own thoughts and methods on this. Silas stepped into the vessel. It was much larger than the one-man pod he had stolen from the Thriskai. It was meant to be manned by a crew of probably half a dozen, with one of them designated to steer. To make matters worse, this region didn't have many hyperlanes to make use of. The Sylphs were one of the weaker races of the region, so their infrastructure was likewise not among the best. Silas would have to return the way he came before looping to his true destination, but that much was fine. He was ready for this. There weren't many days left, but this time he would be killing 2 birds with a single stone. Planet Florinath. In the chaos, the Florinath race had ended up in an oddly no-man's land position. Their best genius, Sorantha Valeria, had been 4th on the rankings even before Silas appeared. Now, she was 5th, having fallen behind 2 Thriskai and a Trakar, not to mention Silas himself. It could be said that even if Silas had never appeared, Sorantha would have still been the odd one out, as the all-seeing eye had only chosen 3. This placed the Florinath in an awkward position. This battle was clearly one that would decide the fate of the galaxy's future as a whole, and as one of the most powerful races, holding top 3 influence in the entire galaxy, they should certainly have been in the mix. But rather than being in the mix, they were instead being courted by 2 separate sides, each one trying to use different tactics. The Trakar were a true war machine, a 4-armed race of behemoths that had once been the strongest in the galaxy before the appearance of the Thriskai. The Florinith were likewise original residents of the galaxy, and the Trakar tried to appeal to this. If the Florinith put their hands on the scale and helped the Trakar, they could work together to push the Thriskai out and reclaim the territory that had once been their own. However, that came with its own clear problems. This would give the Trakar all the power in the situation. At the very least, when there was a balance of the 3 like this, the Trakar and the Thriskai could serve as restraining forces on one another, allowing the Florinith some room to breathe and grow themselves. If the Thriskai were suddenly gone, would it still be so easy? And then there was the appeal of the Thriskai themselves. Petals of the Seeing Thorn was the true reason the Florinith could stand with the Trakar and Thriskai. The scope of understanding about the wider universe that the Thriskai had was truly intriguing, and they claimed to be able to help the Florinith ascend the ranks of the female-only organization. All things considered, the main petals of the Seeing Thorn organization had ignored this branch for a very long time. Often, it was easy to forget they had a parent organization to begin with. This wasn't common knowledge throughout the galaxy either, but the Thriskai had revealed that they were well aware of this. The trouble was that the petals of the Seeing Thorn wasn't a normal organization. It dealt in information and information lending. It built structured relationships and often used its women to court powerful men, only to use these relationships to gather even more pertinent information. Women without real influence were useless to the main organization, and as such, many branches that showed little promise were often forgotten. But the Thriskai promised a chance. Chapter 1103. Promises. The value of the Thriskai's promise weighed heavier. By comparison, the Trakar were trying to sell a dream, one where they almost inevitably ended up on top. However, even so, the Trakar was still the far more manageable enemy to withstand. The Kyeltha were often ignored by their people as well, but that would almost certainly change if one of them became the progenitor of an entire galaxy. Of course, this was just speculation. No one knew what the exact rewards for being the final, chosen, would be. Only Silas had received a directive to become the progenitor of the galaxy. It could be said that had others seen this message, the ultimate result would have been even more feverish than what it already was. But none of that changed the hard decision that lay before Sorantha and her family. Or another familiar Florinith, for that matter. Sorantha reclined almost lazily on a couch, her red, split-leg dress hardly covering her decency as she stretched one thigh over the other. The ruby sparkliness of her gown played against her pale violet skin as though they were both ornaments to one another, the darkness of what should have been the whites of her eyes showing off the signature look of the Florinith. Across from her were 2 other women who seemed to be in a competition of seduction with one another. Or, rather, all 3 of them seemed to be radiating the same sort of delicate and alluring aura. But one of them seemed far inferior to the other 2. Of them, one was familiar. She was none other than the woman who the galaxy currently thought of as Scylla's fiancée, a delicate Florinith of barely 5 feet tall, a far cry from the much taller variations that were her mother and elder sister. As for the other, she was none other than the mother in question, though the 3 truly did look like a trio of sisters. Look at my 2 little girls, each one promised her a true chosen. It seems I've raised the both of you right. Matriarch Valeria giggled away as she sipped her wine, the dance of her tongue looking particularly alluring as she played with the cherry that dangled within. However, neither of her daughters seemed to take this joke as something to be celebrated. Though they maintained their seductive airs, there was something particularly heavy in the air. They were acting as though children caught in the trap of their parents' words, not wanting to take a step forward, and certainly not wanting to admit guilt by taking a step back. Sorantha was technically a bachelorette. In fact, after Nissa had announced her betrothal to Silas of her own accord, their mother had warned her that she couldn't control what Sorantha might try to do. Sorantha could be considered the #1 woman in the galaxy on the lists of best talents. She was not only an impeccable beauty, but her strength spoke for itself, as she was listed as the 4th Titan before Silas appeared. However, she faced the same issues that Lorien did. She wanted to marry a powerful man, but one she could control. Ironically enough, that led to Scylla's as well, because among the best bachelors for women like Lorien and Sorintha to pick from, he was one of the few who stood out. So when Nissa somehow got her hands on him first. Well, at first, Sorintha didn't really care, until quite literally a day later, Scylla's went from a man who was just a great rune master talent to 13th on the Titans leaderboard. Then he went from 13th to 3rd. And now he was 1st. These things hardly took a matter of weeks, in fact, it felt like days most often. There was a part of Sorintha that felt she had lost to her little sister for the first time in her life, and that left a bad taste in her mouth. Nissa had seen something she hadn't, acted on it, invested just a little, and the result, in the end, was shocking. No matter what the situation was now, just by the rules of the system, karma, and how these matters worked, Scylla's was forever tied to Nissa whether he liked it or not. Because of this, Sorintha knew that her chances of stealing Scylla's from Nissa were now practically zero. The difference in Scylla's before and after meeting Nissa was far too great. In fact, the system had already rewarded Nissa more than once for Scylla's feats, proving that it wasn't just speculation on their part that they were tied, but something that the system had long since acknowledged as well. When Scylla's was granted the rank of True Chosen, Matriarch Valeria had sensed the shift in Nissa's luck as well. There was a great amount of it gathering around her, and it had only been supercharged after the most recent announcement. In the end, in order to attempt to counter what seemed to be her little sister becoming a rising star that might take her position in the future, Sorintha had no choice but to make a conditional engagement with Thalric, the Trakar. She agreed to marry him so long as he became the final chosen in the end. Somehow, this led to both Florinith heiresses becoming tied to Chosen of the galaxy-wide quest. But by the same token, it showed just how much power Sorintha hoped to keep under her control. Although the Trakar were dangerous as well, she still felt like she had a better chance at controlling this husband. In fact, if she played her cards right, she might be part of the foundation that helped the Trakar rise up and challenge the mortal Thriskai clans for dominion over this sector. She didn't know exactly what sort of abilities a Chosen might have, but if it was the concentrated luck of an entire galaxy, how could this be missed out on? Unfortunately, all of this left Matriarch Valeria upset, which was why her two daughters were acting as though they sat on pins and needles right now. The matriarch didn't care if her daughters fought or vied for position, even in this situation. The real problem was that neither of them had any results. Nissa's so-called fiancé hadn't contacted her even once. And Sorintha, too scared to relinquish any power, didn't dare to step out on a limb. They were going to run her Valeria clan into the ground like this. Chapter 1104. Playing. Sorintha promised to marry Thalric only after he succeeded. What man would care about a woman like this? This was the most important time to grow deep and intimate feelings, to embed themselves deep within the psyche of such a man. Men were vulnerable in their own way as well. The matriarch had always seen them as little babies that needed their egos constantly stroked. Would Sorintha's proclamation give Thalric a little boost for now, and fuel him with the courage to charge forth and take command? Sure. But once that faded, and he finally satiated his lust by tasting Sorintha's body, that flame would clear and his eyes would see the situation for what it was. At that point, especially after Thalric wielded a great amount of power, if he came out on top in the first place, it would be all too easy for Sorintha to become secondary, tertiary, or even worse in his life. Who knew, he might find some other woman soon after. At that point, what leverage would Sorintha have to stop him from courting someone else or taking on another wife? Sorintha would have had neither the capital of being strong enough herself at that point, nor the sentimental love of a woman who had been there when he needed her most. She would just be a nice ornament to place by the side. And then there was Nissa, the daughter that truly disappointed her the most. She had executed everything perfectly, she was the one that had been there at Scylla's greatest time of need. She was the foundation that helped him to grow to the point he could stand here, even the system acknowledged that oh so clearly. But she was just too mediocre. Her strength was average, her talent was inferior, and if not for her upbringing, she would have nearly nothing to give at all. She had been smart enough to save her body and not give that much, and that might be worth something, at least. But she clearly had no ability to keep Scylla's by her side. In fact, her mistake may very well have been choosing the wrong man. After everything the matriarch had heard about Scylla's Grimblade, he was likely to be too prideful to control properly in the first place. At that point, Nissa would have to rely on the system and karma to restrain him, but that could only survive for so long. The further away Silas got from the pivotal moment Nissa changed his life, the less weight it would hold. Things obviously weren't that simple, because inevitably, being that pivotal point was the only reason Silas could make it so far in the first place. But the problems would start to rear their ugly heads as Silas accumulated more luck unto himself and survived more and more pivotal points on his own. At that point, what leverage Nissa did have would be thrown out the window, and there would be no chance of continuing to use that same leverage at all. None of this even considered the fact that Silas had no chance of winning at this point. The matriarch so very much wished that it had been Sorantha who found Silas first instead of this youngest daughter of hers, but now she could only sit here and look at two failures. In all likelihood, even if the winner was chosen amongst those two by some miracle, the Florineth family wouldn't benefit in the slightest. Not unless the matriarch stopped using her daughters as proxies and instead chose to take the Trakar or Thriskai up on their offers. But at that point, she would be putting the whole family at risk of being wiped out. If she accepted their offers, she would have to ignore the influence she had over the petals of the seeing thorn. No matter how much the main organization had ignored them, there was no way the matriarch would dare to use their power for her own ends. That would be its own form of suicide. Matriarch Valeria swirled her tongue again, flicking up the cherry into her mouth and eating it slowly, seed and all. There wasn't even the slightest sound of a crunch, her actions still smooth and endlessly graceful. But her mood was foul. Nissa looked down at her own cup of wine. There was a sensual expression on her face that belied the struggle in her eyes. She didn't even know how to contact Silas, even if she wanted to. She had only just had the thought when there was a flash on her screen. Nissa's pupils constricted into pinholes, but her expression didn't change in the slightest. In fact, she was even able to hide the look in her eyes with a sip from her cup of wine. Calm and collected, she sat there for several more minutes, the heaviness of the atmosphere only growing until she finally spoke. "I've disappointed you, Mother. A woman can only love with the one heart she has. I took a chance on a man who doesn't seem to want my love back. For now, but I believe my patience will win out. Unlike some others, I didn't make a rash decision based on fear of missing out, and at most I offended a small little branch of a branch, instead of a main clan standout." Nissa said these words with a seductive smile on her face. Then, she stood, her dress flowing down. "I will go and arrange some things in case my hubby decides that he needs me. I will always be ready." After saying that, her hips swayed and she left the room. Her mother and sister watched her leave, the latter carrying some hints of disdain while the former looked half amused and half apathetic. Nissa waited until she had long left and was on a vessel back to a planet she was far more comfortable on before she read the message again. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, her eyes narrowing all the more every time. "You want to join Petals of the Seeing Thorn as a man? What dangerous game are you playing at here, hubby?" Chapter 1105. I love them. Silas stood in silence on the level 30 bazaar. On the roof of the taller high-rise here, he felt like he could see the entire world with a glance. If he tilted his head up just the slightest bit, he might even be able to feel the mistiness of the clouds that hugged the rays of the sun on his forehead. It wasn't long before there was a flash of violet across the skies, a vessel zooming over and stopping in front of him. Honestly, it looked sleeker and faster than even the Thriskai one he had used before, but this wasn't too much of a surprise. The vessel he had stolen from the Thriskai might have been great compared to what Silas was used to, but they were ultimately just grunts. By comparison, Nissa's standing was on another level. It wasn't a surprise that she would have access to much greater things. Soon, a familiar Florineth stepped out. Nissa had an odd air to her that seemed quite a bit more reserved than it would usually be. Maybe she was worried that Silas would just outright kill her, and that wouldn't be too ridiculous of a thought to have either. What these last few weeks had proven to her was that Silas was extraordinarily prideful in ways that she couldn't quite explain. It seemed like a difficult thing to comprehend in such a short time, especially when she hadn't been by his side all the while, but she could just feel it. She had no idea what Silas' true intentions were, honestly. So when she saw that he had somehow taken over the level 30 bazaar, it felt to her like he was making a statement rather than acting out of necessity. With all the restrictions a bazaar had, it was almost useless for a single person to take one over for benefit. You could only maximize the bazaar if you had the backing of an entire organization or family. Also, Nissa knew her own contributions well. If resources she could buy with her own personal wealth were enough to push someone into the top 13, let alone the top 3, and now number 1 overall, it wouldn't be her sister that was currently the 5th Titan, but instead her. Honestly, Nissa didn't know why the system credited her so much with Scylla's advancement. She had seen potential in Scylla's, but she hadn't seen this much, and she definitely didn't think it would bear out so far. In fact, a large part of her thought that even if Scylla's managed to survive his summoning, he would be in a state where he had already ruined his foundation too much to be on any one of those lists. But his potential as a rune master was more than enough for Nissa to invest in him. Maybe together they would be able to make a change and then correct something on his path to the E grade just enough that he could slowly catch up. However, this was nothing like what she expected. What Nissa didn't know was that the system's reaction to her had little to do with her contributions, and yet everything to do with them at the same time. The reason the system reacted the way it had was because Scylla's reacted the way he had. The moment Nissa saved him and gave him a chance to change things, to take steps forward he hadn't been able to on his own, that weight had become an enormous mountain on Scylla's chest. Scylla's was a man who didn't like to face off against his own weakness. But ironically enough, every time he did face such a thing, it looped in a perpetual cycle in his mind, fueling every one of his actions. His memory was such that he could recall every thought, every feeling, every emotion. He could place himself right back in that state continuously and endlessly. He would never forget that day in the volcano. He would never forget Nissa having to save his life because he was too weak to deal with the likes of Lorien. Overcoming the volcano later on didn't matter. Defeating Lorien handily afterward was worthless to him as well. And it was because he continued to allow those moments to fuel him that they were ingrained into his every action, thus making the karmic loop between himself and Nissa so much stronger. She was now a permanent foundation of the man he was, the actions he had taken since, and the actions he would likely take in the future. Everything he did was to avoid that ever happening again. And ironically enough, that was exactly what had given Nissa so much of a chance. Hello, Nissa said slowly. At the moment, she was hyper-aware that she was taking a great risk by coming here. They were no longer in a situation where she could hold her own against Scylla's. If Scylla's wanted to kill her now, even with the protective treasures she had brought, he could easily do it 10 out of 10 times. Scylla's nodded. I wonder, how do you feel about your family? Nissa blinked, not expecting such a question. I love them, she replied without hesitation. How do you really feel? Nissa's eyes widened. There was a silence that fell between the two. Nissa had never expected such a follow-up question. She didn't know how to react to this situation at all. She had answered out of instinct because she was used to putting up a front. What she didn't know was that her wequel was practically an open book to the current Scylla's. He could all but read her mind directly. I don't know, she eventually said. Scylla's nodded. In truth, he had never wanted to kill Nissa. There was a reason that back then, the oath he swore was for Ulrich's head, not Nissa's. The rage he felt back then would have all been directed at himself had Ulrich not foolishly stuck his nose in where it didn't belong. However, what needed to be done here had to be done. Chapter 1106. Afraid. With Chaosheir's class quest looming overhead, the Florineth would have to be dealt with one way or another. But destroying a family didn't mean killing every single living being that was among it. If that was the case, when Chaosheir got the quest to take down the United Coalition of Terra Nova, she would have had to kill both Scylla's and herself since they were both born and raised in the nation. No, Chaosheir's class quest only demanded that the structure that made the target, the target, be taken down. A certain percentage of its leaders and important structures had to be cut down and erased. But the irony of it all was that the reason the Florineth had become a target for Chaosheir was because of Nissa. Chaosheir was most definitely a very jealous wife, and she didn't want anyone near Scylla's. By the same token, though, Scylla's couldn't just let Chaosheir kill Nissa just because, while he also didn't actually care what happened to the rest of the Florineth. The way you say that, Nissa's voice trailed off. She didn't want to say it out loud as though it would make it real, but she was also confused. Why did it sound like Silas wanted to deal with her Florinith race? If he was going to take anyone down, shouldn't it be the Kyeltha or the Dazeth? Why was he targeting the Valeria? You don't seem as confident as usual, Silas suddenly said, catching Nissa off guard again. Nissa shook her head and looked down. It was easy to be confident when you had all the power in your hands. It was substantially harder when you controlled basically nothing. Here she was, just hoping that Silas would throw her a bone. By comparison, if it was Kasari, she would probably be cursing Silas to the high heavens by now, calling him ungrateful and a waste of air. Suddenly, Silas found himself missing her. It was a peculiar feeling, and he wondered just how much that had to do with the lust seed, and how much of that was just all him. Maybe blaming the lust seed was a bit too ridiculous of him. It wasn't as though it was there to elicit such feelings. If that was the case, it would point its spear at Nissa instead. In the end, Silas shook his head. Nissa wasn't the woman he thought she was. Given her interaction right now, she wouldn't be of use at all. She was indecisive, nervous, and might easily be exposed when the time came. It was clear to him in an instant why she was inferior to her elder sister. But by the same token, she was his only easy path to doing what he wanted to do. Nissa deflated as she seemed to tell what Silas was thinking. It was hard to build up confidence in a place like her family when all anyone tried to do was cut her down. She wanted to try and at least put on her usual facade, but that was impossible when she knew how important Silas' next actions were to her. If Silas chose to ignore her again, or even kill her, or maybe use her and toss her to the side again, there would be nothing she could do about it. The weight of that was pressing down as heavily upon her as the mountain on Silas' shoulders, and it was hindering her own thoughts. It was hard, too hard to just ignore the gravity of the situation and press forward. A person's character could be masked for a moment, but eventually it would shine through. Nissa's head lowered even more. She could feel Silas' gaze still on her, but she had nothing to say. "Do you want a chance?" Silas asked. Nissa nodded her head yes, but then shook it no as though she was unsure. She hadn't even realized that by now, the influence of Silas' charisma on her was so great that she couldn't put up a facade even if she wanted to. "What do you want, then?" Silas asked. "I want to be strong." "Didn't you just say you don't want a chance?" "I don't think I could take advantage of a chance even if I was given it. I would just waste it like I usually do." Silas looked at the woman in front of him. A far cry from her previous confident air, she looked as though a slightly stronger gust of wind could just blow her over whenever it so pleased. "Do you know about the petals of the seeing thorn?" Silas pivoted. "Not much, no. They're an information network well respected across the universe. They're actually quite the interesting organization because they are almost like an open secret of sorts. They dabble in espionage and information collection, and yet they're open and above board without any intention of hiding themselves. They weave into and out of elite circles, some of their best well known across the sector, and yet no one ever targets them. Do you know why? They're too powerful," Nissa guessed. "No, they know too much." Nissa's pupils trembled. "It's another form of power, and one probably just as important. Knowledge is as much of a weapon as your fist, and sometimes it's even more powerful. No one is entirely sure how strong the petals of the seeing thorn are, or how deep they run, but no one ever wants to find out because they just might already have a hold of your weakness." "Why are you saying this? Is this supposed to try and comfort me?" "I don't really care about comforting you, to be candid. I do not know you, and though I can acknowledge that you helped me a great deal back then, I hate myself for it. You can do with that information what you please, but I'm telling you this now personally because I can give you an opportunity to spark something new. But if you are too afraid to even take the chance, then I will change my plans." Chapter 1107. Handle. Nissa walked through a garden, weaving lines of thorny vines that wrapped around an archway of greenery. Roses about twice the size one might expect bloomed from time to time, budding into a full spread and then closing as she walked past them, leaving their relaxed forms behind. The blooming of these flowers seemed to follow Nissa's every step, almost like sensory lighting, but carried with it an overwhelming sense that quickly made one forget everything they were seeing. Nissa's steps felt almost trance-like, and it wasn't until she reached the end of the pathway that her eyes awakened somewhat. She shook her head, thinking for the millionth time about just how much she disliked that feeling. As Silas had said, Petals of the Seeing Thorn was an information network, and though they were open, there were aspects of them that remained deeply secretive. Just now, she had exited a sort of maze of flowers. This maze was one that no one, not even the current head of the organization, her mother, knew the full extent of. Instead, depending on one's tier in the organization, you were given a gene. This gene would trigger in the presence of the maze, and your body would move on its own toward the location you were given access to. This would happen even when Matriarch Valeria came to visit. For all they knew, they might have been taking the same route, walking along the same path, and even brushing shoulders before reaching the end. The Petals of the Seeing Thorn was so confident in their maze of thorns that abandoning and ignoring branches like this was quite commonplace for them. But the idea of using up a gene slot for such a thing was something that many women across the universe had to weigh for themselves. It wasn't exactly an easy choice. The higher rank you held, the stronger gene you would need, otherwise, how could it be strong enough to dictate your actions? Honestly speaking, the last time Matriarch Valeria had any interaction with the main branches of the organization at all was when she progressed into the D grade. But even then, it was a perfunctory meeting, where she saw no one, heard no one, and simply had a new gene presented to her under penalty of death. Nissa walked into the organization to find that there was still quite a bit of hustle and bustle, but it was the controlled sort, where hushed whispers and anxiety pulled into a mist that hung heavy in the air. She knew what the problem was without even looking into it. The number of individuals that had joined the trials this time was considerable. It had only been ongoing for what was probably not even a week, but there were a ridiculous number of deaths and incidents already. Normally, women from prominent families would be hesitant to join, but with the galaxy in chaos, many fringe families that didn't have much power of their own found themselves having to balance the hopes of staying independent with actually finding a path of survival for the future. The fight for the bazaars was out of their leagues. Not everyone had a fighter like Silas who could just take one over on their own, and against the likes of the Petals of the Seeing Thorn, the Thriskai, and the Trakar, what chance did they stand even with armies at the disposal? In the end, many decided that attaching themselves to one of the three groups was the best option, leading to the entire galaxy being thrown into turmoil. It had to be remembered that not long ago, the system had wiped out a large number of powers as well, leaving vast gaps in the chasm of power here. Times were dangerous, but it was also an opportunity for these fringe families to try and cover ground they would have never been able to otherwise. Nissa shook her head when she saw this. It would probably just be more of the same. They would be used as pawns, and rather than rushing in to fill the gaps left behind by the dead organizations and families, they would instead be part of the reason more power was concentrated into the hands of the already elite. Nissa. 171. Erythrozalan, LV41, Nithseren, F, Planet Seren, Grade 2 Silver. A familiar young woman rushed up to Nissa, sweeping her up in her arms. Erythra was still the over 8-foot-tall behemoth of a woman that she had been the last time, so lifting the barely over 5-foot-tall Nissa was a matter of great ease. Of course, despite her height, Erythra had a similar seductive beauty to the rest of the Petals of the Seeing Thorn women. It helped quite a bit that she had a distinct, snake-like charm to her. All right, you can put me down, Nissa said with a sultry laugh. You should at least buy me dinner first before you feel me up like this. What can I say? I'm jealous of what that Silas Grimblade gets to feel up on every day. You know how much of a celebrity you are now because of your hubby. Nissa giggled. I know how to choose my men, unlike a certain little slut. Erythra pouted. It's not my fault they've all let me down. You got lucky, let me rub some of that off you and onto me. The Nithseren reached down to cop another feel, and it took Nissa a bit to finally wiggle away. You've been gone for so long. What brought you here now of all times? You know, you're in a little bit of a— Erythra looked around, feeling the cautious gazes on them. Precarious situation. I have another person set to join the trial. Help me set that up. Another person. You're sending them to their deaths. You know, the later you join, the harsher the penalty. Don't worry about that, we'll handle it, Nissa said with a smile. There was a light of confidence in her eyes. But it was also clear that she had put up a facade once again. Chapter 1108. Mythical Foul Mouth. Nosphaline's body continuously twitched, subtle but controlled movements coming from her in almost awkward waves. The world warped around her. Or rather, them. Silas was currently in total merge, his body hidden within Nosphalene's, who was currently acting as the new medium for his hibernation realm. With the improvement to his professions, Silas found that his hibernation realm was much more flexible. Now, he didn't have to rely on throwing his limp body into Gogo's mouth. So when he completed total merge with Nosphalene, he could stick around with her. The twitching of Silas' body suddenly stopped as his thoughts glazed over. When his sight cleared up, he found himself in a desert, scalding hot pieces of sand slashing against his, or rather, their, face. His thoughts and Nosphalene's merged, and the two had practically become one existence. Because Nosphalene's thoughts were far more mature and carried more depth than Gogo's, it was difficult for Silas to continue steering things. But at the same time, Silas wasn't arrogant enough to just cancel his total merge with Nosphalene right now either. He also didn't dare to try and circumvent the petals of the Seeing Thorn trials any more than he already had. This organization was still far beyond him, and he wasn't at the point just yet where he could act with impunity around these matters. It also had to be remembered that outsiders couldn't interfere very well in the matters of this galaxy. Unless they were given jurisdiction to do so. The last time this happened, it was because Silas had purposely broken one of the rules of the Golden Grove. If he was found doing the same here, that would give the petals of the Seeing Thorn an excuse to do much the same. While he was alright with that eventuality, it couldn't be done just yet. Not until he had gotten what he wanted. And in order to do that, he would need to see something through first. Nosphalene Tideborn, Bronze. Level, 50. Physical, 4999. Greater than, Strength, 4999. Greater than, Constitution, 4999. Greater than, Dexterity, 4999. Greater than, Speed, 4999. Mental, 9999. Greater than, Intelligence, 9999. Greater than, Wisdom, 9999. Greater than, Charisma, 9999. Will, 9999. Skills. Greater than Projected Shift. Greater than Dreamy Pupils. Greater than Double Vision. Greater than Charm Veil. Greater than Charm Pulse. Greater than Glide. Greater than Charm Counter. Gene Talents. Greater than Compelling Gaze. Greater than Siren's Call. Comprehensions. Greater than Mesmeric's Totem. Nosphalene had progressed very well for a talent of Earth, but in comparison to Gogo, she was shockingly inferior. It was also difficult for Silas to make use of her for any reason other than the usefulness of her individual skills themselves. In total merge, it was also very difficult for Silas to use his Scorpion Warlord armor. Because his mind was fused with Nosphalene's, he couldn't sink himself into the mental state of a scorpion well enough to draw the runes with the same speed and accuracy he normally would. However, Silas honestly didn't think that he would need much strength here. He also didn't plan on being here for very long either. Closing his eyes, Silas' luck and visualization spread out, a terrain of vast nothingness. As expected, chaosheir wasn't within his 2-kilometer range, but it would have been a pretty wild coincidence if she had been one way or another. However, he could feel her general direction. Silas opened his eyes and looked off toward that distance. Then, he stomped a foot and launched himself. His telekinesis pulled himself and Nosphalene into the air, moving them so fast across the desert that one would have thought they were a bullet shot out from a gun. Who is that? There were many people watching the scene of the trials. Usually, it was an event mostly ignored by the vast majority, as there was rarely anything interesting unless a talent like Sorantha took part. The trials were usually just a race to the end, and normally, if there was no drama, the girls would just focus on surviving whatever deadly traps were in their way. It was much less entertaining to watch them battle it out against the elements than to see them at each other's throats. But the latter was exactly what was happening this year, especially with a formerly little-known firecracker by the name of chaosheir Grimblade. One could very well imagine just how much attention the last name had brought, but the trial had only started so recently that many hadn't picked up on it just yet. Plus, the galaxy was so large that two people having identical names, yet being completely unrelated to one another, was quite commonplace. However, as chaosheir's feats began to pile up, and the myths of her foul mouth spread even further, more and more people were starting to pay attention to her as well. When they backtracked, they saw that chaosheir was actually having quite an easy time with the trial initially. Had it not been for the friend she insisted on bringing along, she would have been in first place without a doubt. Even so, she had been moving along well until she pissed off a few Tracar branch disciples who she, affectionately, coined, droopy titty heifers. Those watching didn't dare to laugh at this because of what it meant to offend the Tracar in these times. But the sentiment was true enough. The biology of the Tracar was such that, in order to use their forearms freely and nimbly, their chests tended to be wider and taller than most other races. For the men, that made them look especially masculine and chiseled. But for the women, well, it was safe to say that chaosheir's commentary didn't go over very well. This led to chaosheir and her friend, Olivia, being thrown into a wild chase and forced into hiding for the next few days. Until there was a sudden reversal and chaosheir actually took the head of one of the two stronger Tracar. Unfortunately, before she could take the second, Olivia ended up heavily injured and chaosheir had to run again for the sake of saving her life. If she hadn't, she would have lost her friend. Just as unfortunately, that gave the second Tracar, Malevolous Dazeth, the chance to recover as well. She began to hunt chaosheir down once more with added vigor. Now, with all these oddities swirling about, a new party with shocking strength was coincidentally flying right toward the location of the most heated confrontation in the trial world. Didn't she know how dangerous the world was? However, just as they had that thought and a sandworm wyvern bit out from the dunes below at the flying Nosfaline. The creature lost its head in an instant, so fast no one saw how the blue-skinned woman even took action. Chapter 1109. Puzzle. Scylla's and Nosfaline shot through the air with a blazing pace. With their wills meshed into one, Scylla's might not have been sure what his stats were currently, but what he did know was that it was fast enough to cut through this desert in what felt like the blink of an eye. Nissa hadn't been lying. The later you joined, the more troublesome it was to participate in the trial. The fact that it was so lax with their starting times to begin with was already odd, but that was because what the organization was testing was very different from what one might be expecting. The Petals of the Seeing Thorn was an information network, and it rewarded the resourcefulness of its women, not their individual strength, though the latter of these two was certainly helpful. However, observing the progression of those that entered before you was obviously still a bit cheap. So when new participants entered, they did so from worse starting positions, both in terms of distance to travel and dangers to face. Yet, one would think that Scylla's was making a joke of their trials. Every time an earthen creature rose from the sandy dune, Nosfaline's body would simply flick out a finger, and they would lose their heads. Fast, deadly, and without the slightest hesitation. Rivers of blood streamed, and the brown golden sand was dyed through in a rusty color and odor. In the outside world, Nissa watched with a slight twitch in her lips. Scylla's hadn't explained to her what he was going to do, but he knew that Nosfaline was someone that called him master. She was so completely obedient, and beautiful, for that matter, that it was hard for her not to take second, third, and fourth looks at her. Nissa wasn't opposed to Nosfaline's appearance. One of her best friends, the woman standing right by her side this moment, was also from a snake-like race. But this. When had a woman so powerful appeared? She was an overlord of the galaxy, or else there wouldn't even be a chance to join in the first place. So how had such an outstanding woman gone unnoticed for so very long? Who did you bring, Nissa? Erythra practically gasped out. Those creatures were all at least level 30, and not normal level 30s either. They were probably at least F+ grades as well, and there was just such a shocking number of them. Scylla's had barely crossed a kilometer, but he had already come across 4 of them. In fact, they only seemed to be appearing more and more rapidly as the commotion they triggered increased. In response, the number of people paying attention to this new recruit also increased. Nosfaline's tail swayed, and large streams of energy took shape. Sparkling scales of silver danced beneath the sunlight, her wings spreading out and casting a large shadow on the land beneath. The power coursing through her right now was intoxicating. She was very much aware that she was fused with Scylla's right now, but she wanted more. Silas found that Nosfaline was giving more and more of herself away to him, as though she wanted to experience what it felt like to be him, to be on top of the world. He gladly obliged. 3 earthen wyverns leapt out from the soil at once, their long, snaking bodies twisted and causing whirlpools in the sandy dunes below. In that moment, it looked as though the entire desert had sunken an entire several meters, holes of unfathomable depths opening up beneath them. Silas spread out Nosfaline's arms, his rune control coming back a measure as Nosfaline released more control to him. Chi. Their fingers only pressed out 3 times, and a bloody hole appeared in 3 heads the size of small hills. The wounds seemed too tiny, so insignificant. And yet, in a breath of time, their wills had been completely and wholly snuffed out. They didn't stop in the air for even a moment, blasting through the encirclement as the desert gave way to cracked lands, and then from cracked lands to sparse grass, before finally becoming a long river extending from what looked like an almost barren ocean. The ocean was dark and so salted, just standing above it made Silas' nose twitch. The beach near it was rock and salt formations, forming seas of grey, white, and black that played off of one another. But the river looked even more eerie in a way, its winding body looking particularly black, almost like oil running across smooth rock and bending to the paths of the shores. To the other side, however, there was a forest. Though it started off sparse, the further into the distance you went, the more beautiful it became, until green-capped mountains could be seen in the far-off landscape. Interesting. Silas felt his perception being warped here. His luck was telling him that chaosheir was in the direction of the greenergy, but something felt off about it. He tilted his head slightly, trying to get in touch with more of his rune mastery. He hadn't realized until now just how much total merge dimmed his rune usage ability, but clearly Gogo being a blank slate made that much harder to notice in the past. It seemed he would have to factor this in more as Gogo matured. Nosfaline seemed enamored with the feeling of Silas' strength, so she relinquished more, and slowly, an odd picture began to form in Silas' mind. A maze. Silas realized what was happening. Both directions were correct, one was shorter than the other. Somehow, the Dead Sea was the better option. The green forest was the worst option. The deadly river was the best option. There has to be another clue here somewhere, Silas thought. The level of rune mastery you would need to figure it out like I did is way too high. Silas knew more about his relative position in the world now. He knew that none of the participants could possibly be expected to do what he did just now. Which meant, I see. Chapter 11:10. Malevolence. Nosfaline waved her tail and they shot forward like the crack of a whip, slithering with such pace through the air that one would have thought they'd spark a fire of friction between their body and the raging winds. In an instant of time, they had crossed the distance to the winding river and dove in, vanishing from sight. Silas realized that there was a very clear deduction to be made. The ocean was very still, so much so that it was hardly kicking up any waves. By comparison, the rivers were truly raging. This much was odd, especially since they were connected, but not enough to raise eyebrows. The ocean was too vast in comparison to the river. Why would the speed of one be dictated by the other? The river followed a much narrower path, so it wouldn't be too much of a surprise. However, there were several more factors to take into consideration. This was the wider world, not Earth. That wasn't an ocean, it was a lake. Great, so lakes in the wider universe could be much larger than the lakes Silas was used to on Earth. Why did that matter? Well, lakes weren't supposed to be salty, for one, and the river was oddly black. No matter where in the universe you were, that was odd, and something interesting had to have happened to cause it. Regardless, the most important thing to notice was that the green forest was a trap. Any forest that could flourish so well while near such a density of salt was to be questioned. It was almost like a honey trap in the depths of the abyss. But by comparison, even though the lake was safer, it was also the center of power causing this change. It would be easier to make it through the lake, but not easy enough that it would save one of all hardship. In the end, the river that looked the most menacing was the safest. That was because while it looked black on the surface, it was actually flushing out everything that was good from this region. The black was nothing more than illusion to make it look more menacing than it was. This trial was a test to see the resourcefulness of the participants, their abilities to pick up on context clues from their environment and act accordingly. After understanding this, Silas felt that he had no need to waste his time on these meaningless puzzles anymore. These sorts of things he could do in his sleep, especially with his new Rolodex of information. If he could see through all of the tricks with his rune mastery, why wouldn't he, instead of standing around trying to decipher these brain teasers? And that was exactly what he did. The petals of the seeing thorn watched as Nosfaline tore through one puzzle after another at a pace that had taken the other girls days to complete. No, most of the girls weren't even placed this far back in the race because they had joined much earlier. By the time Silas began to catch up to the most common starting regions, his greatest limiting factor wasn't even the danger anymore, it was instead the distances he had to fly. Soon, the challenges became so easy that Silas didn't even have to kill to deal with them. He just flew by too fast for them to even react. It was only after reaching a certain point that the challenges began to ramp up in difficulty somewhat again. But even then, they were still easier than the starting position. But in less than a day, Silas had already caught up to the leads of the group. Bang, bang, bang. Malevolence Dazeth smashed against a stone continuously, more enraged than she could put into words. Her forearms worked together like the pistons of a hydraulic press as she smashed a heavy stone to bits of ash and sand. Chaosheir had escaped again. It felt like every time was another slap to her face, another humiliation along her path. It was so infuriating she couldn't even put it into words. Her eyes glanced down to her ample chest, rippling with both muscle and soft tissue that bounded in her rage. There wasn't a single ounce of droopiness to be found. At least, that was what she thought until she caught her reflection in the nearby lake. From the side, she suddenly felt like it extended out too far and would have definitely drooped a bit if not for her armor forcing it to keep its shape. With a roar, Malevolence picked up another heavy stone and threw it at the water. Boom! A surging current rose with a backdraft that shook the earth and sent a pillar of water into the air. However, the pillar of water didn't go very far before a woman with a long, snaking tail appeared. She frowned for a moment, then held out a hand. The pillar of water that had been about to blast into her stopped in its tracks as though reflected by an invisible wall. It crashed back down in a wave that buried Malevolence completely, drenching her from head to toe. Who. Malevolence's roars had been ignored until now, but when she suddenly spoke as though she was calling someone out, her allies rushed to the lake, turning up in droves until they saw what the situation was. High in the air, Nosfaline looked down. Silas could feel that Chaosheir was around here, probably close by, likely hiding. From the looks of it, and the rage of this woman, Silas doubted it was a coincidence. Chaosheir probably wasn't as smart as Silas, not close. But what she was good at was understanding people. Her sharp tongue was only that sharp because she knew exactly how to get under someone's skin. Well, that, and she had a certain way with words. The fury of this woman and Chaosheir was almost certainly related. In that case, Silas raised Nosfaline's hand and casually slammed down. Malevolence became a pile of flesh and blood. Chapter 11:11. Thank you. The scene in the greeting hall of the Petals of the Seeing Thorn was one of absolute silence. Malevolence was one of their strongest participants. No, probably the strongest participant in this year's trial. This wasn't saying much for the Petals of the Seeing Thorn as a whole. But when it came to the emphasis she had received from the spectators until now, it was enough to paint the picture of someone who had true strength in the public consciousness. And yet, a single raise of the hand, a single swipe down, and she was dead. Just like that. There wasn't the slightest grace, not the slightest hesitation, not even an acknowledgement of the race she came from or the powers supporting her to her back. Just death. At this point, Nosfaline's feats hadn't just caught the attention of the general Petals of the Seeing Thorn Alliance, but that of their elders, and even their matriarch as well. Matriarch Valeria watched with an interested gaze, flicking one grape after another into her mouth, half wondering if she should get one of her more attractive servants to do this for her. But in the end, she seemed too interested in Nosfaline. It wasn't every day that such an interesting pawn appeared. How could she not be fascinated by what she was seeing? Interesting, interesting, interesting. What little scheme are you a part of, exactly? Who sent you to mess things up in my organization? She could seem to smell the scheme coming from a million miles away, but it made her wonder what the purpose of it was. And more importantly, who had grown such a powerful little trump card in secret like this? There weren't many level 50s with this level of strength, and all of them should be on the Titans leaderboard. So why wasn't this one up there? Sorantha, my baby girl. You will go and greet this one. Yes, mother, Sorantha said obediently. Nosfaline swept a gaze across the ones down below and didn't say a single word. Looking down from above, she and Silas only casually looked in the direction chaosheir was hiding in before jetting off into the distance. Silas hadn't come here to save chaosheir, and judging by what he had heard, she was doing well enough on her own. If he could control his temper, he would have probably left Malevolence around as a challenge for her. But there wasn't a single soul in this universe with the capital to bully his woman. Once again, Silas changed his focus to the end of the path, shooting off even faster than he had come. It seemed that even though he had arrived last, he would be the first to finish. That son of a bitch. I'm gonna kill him when I see him next, chaosheir, buried deep in an underwater cave of the lake, barely holding onto a pocket of air, grumbled. What happened? Olivia asked. Quote ellipsis. Just an annoying prick. So your husband. My boy toy, actually. You wouldn't be so love-struck over a boy toy, hallucinating about him day in and day out. I am not hallucinating. This is a women's-only organization, Madam Grimblade. What makes you think he could be here? chaosheir rolled her eyes, too tired to explain. She just knew, all right. Delusion at its finest. Olivia sighed, and then winced slightly as her ribs reminded her they were both cracked and swollen. Are you all right? Quote ellipsis. Sorry for dragging you down, Ray. What are you talking about? You carried me when I couldn't even lift a finger and that damned piece of shit City Stelle wouldn't let me leave and go anywhere. I'm just reciprocating a bit. Shut up before I crack another one of your ribs. Be obedient and I might let you test drive him for a bit. Really? Olivia's eyes lit up. Chaosheir's eyes narrowed. I was going to say that you can daydream about him and jill yourself off, I won't be offended. But why do you sound so excited all of a sudden? You whore, that is not what you made it sound like. That was a trap. I'm not the one pining after their best friends, man. I am not pining. He's just a celebrity. He is the furthest thing from a celebrity. His name is literally broadcast across the galaxy once a week at this point. What is that if not a celebrity? I'm allowed to fantasize. Ugh, how many of your harlots am I going to have to fight off at this point? The laughter of the two women filled the cave. Nosfaline stepped out from the realm, hardly having broken a sweat. She looked around and raised an eyebrow, feeling that the situation was a bit odd. Rather than exiting from where she came, it was a dark room with walls so smooth there was no clear exit path. It looked like the sort of place you interrogated criminals. Not the petty thief or even gang-affiliated kind, but instead the sort of hardened criminals that would end up on a government's most wanted list. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing at all. Until there was a click and a door opened to the side. Slowly, Sorantha walked in, her expression carrying the same hints of seduction as always. Why hello there, Nosfaline Tideborn, is it? You're quite the interesting character. I didn't expect this, I truly didn't. Nosfaline blinked, seemingly in confusion. Didn't expect what? I'm not entirely sure why or how you ended up here, but what I can say is thank you, Sorantha spoke without explaining, her smile bright and airy. Thank you, Nosfaline asked in confusion. Sorantha moved before Nosfaline could react, a fist ripping right through her chest. Nosfaline's eyes widened. I was wondering how an overlord talent like you didn't appear on the Titans leaderboard, but now I understand. You have something that doesn't belong to you, is that it? That's Silas Grimblade. He disappeared from the rankings. It seems that he overextended himself on his little summoned world. And now. Sorantha's body shook as the mark of a true chosen appeared on her. Nosfaline's eyes slowly dimmed and she fell into a pool of her own blood. The laughter of the Valeria clan heir practically boomed. The petals of the seeing thorn would ignore them in practically all other situations. But if one of their own had the mark of a true chosen, with a chance to have the luck of an entire galaxy centered on them, would they continue to do so? When that time came, and their Valeria gained their support, why would they need to fear the Thriskai and the Trakar? Chapter 11-12. Help. Sorantha stared at Nosfaline's corpse for a long time. She couldn't believe that she had actually lucked into such a thing, but at the same time, she knew the sort of risk she had just taken. If she had told her mother in advance, she might not have taken the steps either. The problem with what she had done was obvious. Nosfaline was now an official member of the Petals of the Seeing Thorn. Killing any random member was fine. Killing a member that had the mark of a true chosen on him was a different matter entirely. Technically speaking, both were issues. It was against the rules to do such a thing no matter what, and it could especially put her mother in a poor position, considering the fact she was the current head. But it was a risk that Sorantha had to take no matter what. At first, she hadn't even trusted her own senses, but as she began to put things together, it was like she could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Sorantha took a deep breath. Get rid of the corpse, handle the fallout, contact her mother and explain what happened. The thoughts came in steady streams, and she calmed herself. When the time came, all of the petty little details would be blown over by the results. In the end, that was all that would matter. Sorantha made a move toward the exit and opened the door. She had already planned all of this out. But her new luck almost instantly flashed warnings in her mind. Her head snapped back just as she opened the doors, and a large black mass pushed her out of the way, rushing out in a stream. Sorantha's eyes widened. What was that? Stop. She reached out, her strength surging. Ether with a particularly strong life character bloomed, but there was nothing to latch onto. Instead, vines surged out from her arm, reaching forward and grasping the tail of the creature before her. Chi, chi, chi. It snapped to pieces, shredded apart by an intent that was almost beyond Sorantha's understanding. It felt like a will heavy enough to make her fall to a knee. Emerald lightning flashed, and her ether was suppressed down to its very core. It was at that moment Sorantha finally saw enough of the black mass to understand what she was seeing. A snake. A snake so large she questioned how it had even managed to make it past the door. Somehow, it had been in an amorphous, shadowy shape just a moment ago, but now it was solid and whole, worming its way down the hallways with such a swaying abdominal strength that the underground passageways were swaying along with it. It was so fast that Sorantha couldn't keep up at all. A part of her wondered why it wasn't attacking her, but when she remembered Nosfaline and her head snapped back into the room, she widened her eyes in horror. Nosfaline was gone. That creature wasn't here to attack her, and it was smart enough to know this wasn't the time for revenge. It was here to escape with Nosfaline and give her a chance to survive. Sorantha had been sure that Nosfaline was dead. She shattered her heart. But Sorantha also knew enough about this world that she wasn't confident enough to say that that was definitely enough to end it all. Even on Earth, the lines blurred between life and death were variable. Was a person dead when their brain waves stopped? Was it when their heart stopped pumping? When they stopped breathing, maybe. Maybe when their organs shut down. But sometimes brain waves continued even after a body was long dead. Sometimes people could live so long as a health professional pumped their hearts for them. Sometimes breathing was obstructed by something, and someone could gasp for breath moments later. In the wider universe, the lines were even more blurry than they were on Earth, and that was especially the case for someone with a strong will like Nosfaline. Damn it. Sorantha didn't chase. She knew it would be a waste of energy. In this case, she couldn't have the perfectly curated plan play out the way she expected. She had to contact her mother now. Only she would have the strength to ensure that things didn't leak. No one knew the way out of this place. The maze wasn't locked down, but it would shut down one's thoughts, presence, and memories. But there was another state the maze could enter, one that could be triggered by the matriarch to stop all attempts at leaving completely. Would that blow up this matter? Yes, but so long as no one knew the exact reasons, that much would be fine. Sorantha was sure that it wouldn't even get that far, but she needed her mother to do this out of an abundance of caution anyway. This location was deep within Petals of the Seeing Thorn territory. Before Nosfaline's corpse could even make it to the maze, she would have to exit this underground tunnel system, and even if she managed to do that, there would already be a large number of experts waiting. Matriarch Valeria wasn't the only D-grade in this organization, but using them would be a problem. There were constantly people vying for position in the organization and hoping for a moment of weakness to pounce. But the Valeria clan had their own extensive supporters. Among them, there were other D grades as well, along with a large number of E grades. Just one of them should be enough to deal with the snake. It was powerful, but Sorantha knew an F grade when she saw it. However, caution was also the name of the game. Mother, I need your help. There was silence on the other line. Sorantha already knew that her mother was enraged, but she likewise knew that she was waiting for the rest of the explanation. Sorantha didn't hesitate to spill everything. They'll be on their way. Chapter 11:13. Lise. Gogo was no longer in control of his body, and Nosfaline was no longer in Gogo's mouth either. The latter had long gone into the hibernation realm to be healed, while Gogo was now in a state of total merge with Silas. After more time in Nosfaline's body, Silas had grown even more used to what it felt like to control a snake-like body. It came more naturally to him. But it was also a process that came from the depths of his insight path talent as well. He had a natural understanding of his contracts, and that came with a comprehension of how to use their bodies as well. Not only had one kind for me, the path that birthed insight as a path talent, reached level 50, but the overall profession had advanced even further, making this feeling far more natural now than it had been in the past. Silas didn't hesitate to move like the wind, every sway of Gogo's body feeling almost like an extension of his own limb, as though he had been controlling this body from the very start. There was now a comfortability that hadn't been there the first time he used total merge. Especially now that his body wasn't in Gogo's mouth either. However, Silas was facing another problem. In order to free fall off of the Titan's leaderboard and pretend to be dead, he had no choice but to take out a great deal of his own talent. His stats had plummeted, and right now the only things he had access to were his will and charisma. He had even plucked his classes out of himself. He was simply a shell of his former self. Without Gogo, even a child could stab him to death right now. But he had a plan, and it was going perfectly right now. Silas' maw opened and he roared, a series of runes ahead shattering. They had hardly formed, but Silas had already seen through them. He had expected this already. This building would be going into lockdown. And without his true chosen status, his ability to influence worlds that weren't his own had plummeted as well, leaving his RuneSpark mastery a lot weaker than it had been in the past. Of course, his true chosen status had also been personally taken out by him. When Silas thought about it, what was his true chosen status if not a chance to influence his potential? And wasn't that something that he could directly control with Taboo Bond? And if that was the case, couldn't he just take it out of his body and give it to someone else? When Silas realized this, a plan began to formulate in his head, but he knew that he would need to nudge things in the right direction. If he failed to do things appropriately, he would end up having lost everything for no reward in return. In order for this plan to succeed, he needed the petal of the seeing thorn to feel the pressure, and the best way for him to do that was to escape. No, not just escape, but do so while stirring up the greatest amount of chaos with the smallest amount of damage to himself. Boom! Silas rounded a corner, arching Gogo's body to the side. The immature horns on their head sent sparks flying as they grazed against the walls, leaving deep grooves that hardly slowed them down at all, but anchored them just enough that they didn't lose any speed despite such a sharp change in direction. He was truly at the point of using the body as though it was his own, but the petals of the seeing thorn had also reacted by now. Up ahead, in the halls of endless black, an elevator opened up and a middle-aged woman with flowing hair that looked like a sparkling white slug's body appeared. Despite her age, her looks were no less enticing than any other seeing thorn, a dress of sky blue that perfectly matched the strip of sapphire that rolled down the length of her hair hugging her curves tightly. However, in the slit of her dress, one could see a garter belt fastened with what must have been a half-dozen leaf-shaped daggers. Even so, what anyone's eyes would be drawn to the most was the sapphire bow in her hand. Lise Cameron, EE. Level, 72. Silas felt a pressure ram into him. This woman was powerful without the slightest doubt, and he had suddenly become an enormous target. He roared as though a beast that had lost his mind, but Lise calmly plucked out a sapphire arrow with an elegant stroke of her fingers through the air. Ether gathered in a surging tide as she drew her bow back. Shuuuuu. It was hard to tell when she released it. It was so fast, so sharp, that it appeared before Gogo in an instant. But then there was a warp in the air, and Gogo's enormous body vanished, a pulsing portal appearing for a brief instant of time. Lise was caught off guard, her eyes widening. Was this a creature with a rare spatial ability? It was a thought that she was only able to have for a brief instant of time before a man wreathed in black scaled armor appeared before her. You. Silas punched out, blood seeping from his body in waves. Without his usual array of genes, he couldn't maintain a normal fusion with Gogo at all. But this time, that wasn't his goal, he just needed to close the distance. Lise dodged out of the way of the punch, and was then suddenly confused by how shockingly weak it was. What was this person thinking? Despite her haphazard dodge, her movements returned to elegance moments later, her hair shifting and her leg kicking out in a high arc toward the side of Silas' face. Silas vanished, and Lisa's leg passed through air at first, and was then rejected by the portal of the hibernation realm. Only for Gogo's maw to appear as she lost her balance. There was a bloody flash, and then the level 72 seeing thorn was bitten in two, a savage crunch echoing through the air. Chapter 11:14. Rampage. Gogo's body slammed into the elevator, blood flying from his maw. Because of the switch, Silas had ended up heavily injured. Then he reversed it for the sake of a quick victory. Total merge didn't stop Silas from fusing while heavily injured. But because Silas had ended up so injured when he went to his main body and completed a fusion, his injuries were transferred over to Gogo. However, none of this stopped them. Silas' senses darted around. He knew too little about the layout of this organization, but he had his senses. The flow of runes in a place could tell you a lot about what it needed to do. If one had X-ray vision and could see through the electric wires and plumbing in a house through the walls, there was a lot you could tell about it instantly. Which places were drawing the most power, where the vulnerabilities were, the networks of hallways. Right now, Silas wasn't viewing the world with his eyes at all. He was peering into the mesh of reality, seeing through the strands of life itself, and pulling himself through those secrets one step after another. When others saw a wall, he saw through 3, 4, even 5 of them at a time. Because he could see the wires, and not the walls alone, he knew exactly how this maze of underground networks was set up, and he knew exactly how to get out. He could also deduce which regions had the most people by which locations were pulling on the most power, and he knew that this elevator was going to open up before he even got here. Everything was under his control. Even this elevator itself. His intention pulled on a hidden card on Lisa's body, and soon he forced the runes to activate. The doors slammed open just as the sound of figures rounding corners came. Gogo curled his body tight, barely fitting into the elevator at all. It was clear that such a large vessel was designed for moving volumes of cargo up and down. As for what this region was exactly, Silas didn't care. At least not for now. Blaring warning sounds flooded petals of the seeing thorn, confusing signals firing and throwing the entire lobby into chaos. The changes caught everyone off guard. In one moment, they were all watching Nosfaline take the final steps to break through the trial in record time, but in the next moment, all hell had broken loose. Nissa felt her heart skip a beat. She was the only one that knew the connection between Nosfaline and Silas, and she didn't feel like this timing was a coincidence. In fact, even if it hadn't been the case that Nosfaline had just finished, she would have still put 2 and 2 together. The Petals of the Seeing Thorn was a top organization of the galaxy. Even in these troubled times, there was no way that they would be attacked so flippantly and without warning. Especially since they hadn't even chosen a side. There was no reason for it. Maybe. Nissa hurried to shake her head. She thought of her sister's promise to the Trakar prince, but that shouldn't be enough either. This was definitely all Silas. As though to reply to her thoughts, the roar of a black serpent filled the skies. A menacing wolf fell from above, and one after another, disciples of the Petals of the Seeing Thorn found themselves fainting in droves. Gogo snaked through the hall, gliding so high his back nearly ground against the tall ceilings. Waves of suffocating aura flooded them from above, and from time to time, some E-grades would die a horrible death. Nissa's vision went white and she passed out much like the others. Her last thoughts were those of confusion, wondering just what was going on. Was that snake related to Silas? And in that case, how could he ever possibly escape? Matriarch Valeria moved with a frown on her face. She had sent more than enough E-grades that this matter should have been handled already, but the information she was getting back. Well, the main issue was that she wasn't getting nearly enough of it in the first place. There was no news, and no news in this situation was bad news. The matriarch stepped out of her vessel, her heels clicking along the stony surface of an asteroid as she faced off against a familiar portal. It seemed that she would just have to handle this herself. Silas unleashed unholy hell on the petals of the seeing thorn. To his luck, he didn't sense any degrades, but he also didn't cast the beast totem just yet. With the beast totem, Gogo would truly be a one-man army, even with the injuries they had sustained. But Silas found himself actually having to hold back. It definitely wasn't because the petals of the seeing thorn were weak. Instead, they were an information network, and most of their powerhouses wouldn't spend time in the organization itself to begin with. They would instead be off doing what they did best, laying seeds and gathering information. Because the organization was also out of conflict most times, their sense of danger and reactions to it were also limited. But that was exactly why Silas knew that he could get away with this. Gogo's tail slapped down and a swath of lower-class E-grades found their bodies shattered to minced meat. Almost there. Silas had just had the thought when he felt a sensory perception sweep over him. It was like a strong, endless tide. Even when not aimed at him specifically, it felt like he would crumble beneath it nonetheless. But Silas' gaze only turned steely. He knew that this would happen, and he was ready for it. In fact, his timing could have only been said to be perfect. That perception only existed because his luck was warning him. But this time, he directly ignored it, storming into the maze of seeing thorns at the very same moment Matriarch Valeria did. Chapter 11:15. Seeing Thorn. Silas felt a huge rejection the moment he stepped foot into the maze. One would have thought that it was easy, and even a child could think of what the plan might be. If he was in the maze at the same time as Matriarch Valeria, then the latter would be vulnerable while he was not. While Nosfaline had been the one to fuse with the unique gene of the petals of the seeing thorn, Silas had obviously not, so how could the maze affect him? But if the seeing thorn maze could be handled so easily, then it wouldn't exist in the first place. The reason the maze itself existed was to eliminate human error. Something like having to get anyone who stepped into it to have the seeing thorn unique gene first was precisely the sort of human error they would want to avoid. If that was the case, then any enemy who crossed into their territory could make it to the maze and go through it without obstruction, while their own people would be helpless within it. Again, if things were so easy, the petals of the seeing thorn would be foolish and not nearly as well respected as they were. Silas experienced that immediately. The unique gene wasn't just there to hide the exact location of the petals of the seeing thorn. It was also a form of protection for its people. The seeing thorn wasn't just any moniker, nor was it just a clever play on words fusing the intelligence-gathering aspects of the organization with a metaphor about the women that graced their halls. Though, it could be that as well. The seeing thorn was one of the most powerful plant existences in the sector. They were an invasive species known for their ability to swallow entire planets whole and mutate ecosystems to their own liking. The seeing thorn unique gene caused the maze to mistake you as one of it. When it wasn't on your person, it treated you like everything else. Something to devour. This alone would be something that was shocking enough. But, this was only the tip of the iceberg for the seeing thorn. The creature's description didn't do it enough justice. What did it mean for something to be capable of swallowing a planet? It meant that it could overtake its function, suppress its core, overwhelm it and become, in effect, its progenitor not by right, but by force. This sort of concept wasn't something that most could even wrap their heads around. Even if it took a seeing thorn millennia to accomplish such a thing, it was more than capable of doing it. But there was one thing that would make its prowess as clear as day. The seeing thorn was a B-grade race. Chi. Gogo had only just appeared when his body was torn in a countless number of ways, ripped and torn to near shreds. His body was so large that hundreds of thorns shredded his scales apart. Every ounce of pain was felt by Silas, and he would have raised his head to the skies to roar, if it wasn't for the fact the thorns had already grown vines to fill up Gogo's throat and lungs. In another instant of time, they would be dead. But Silas was more than prepared for all of this. He knew that exactly this would happen because he had information. If he hadn't planned out every meticulous detail, he would have never dared to take this step at all. Just as the vines pulled and were about to shred Gogo to pieces, Silas pulled hard on his connection with Nosfaline. Semi-fusion. The thorny vines froze in place, confusion rippling out from it in waves. It pulled out, and as it did so, a shuddering pain racked their bodies. But Silas knew that this was important. He needed this much blood and gore left behind here. He had had no choice but to allow Gogo to be injured to this extent. Otherwise, he would have activated semi-fusion long ago. Just enough, just enough. Silas held onto his will, gritting Gogo's teeth so hard it felt as though they might snap. Finally, the last of the thorns were pulled out from his body. There was a moment of silence before Silas collapsed. Then he began to feel his consciousness fading a bit as the unique gene tried to take hold and blur his mind. But it was also clear that the connection was far weaker than it was normally. While Silas' mind was fading away somewhat, it wasn't to the point that he had completely lost it. This was a combination of two main things. The first, semi-fusion. Because the fusion wasn't full and whole, the impact of the gene wasn't as deep and resounding as usual, making it more manageable. The second thing was the fusion of Silas and Gogo's mind. It was much harder to play on their consciousness when it was trying to act on two opposing minds at the same time. It worked. Gogo coughed up mouthfuls of blood, their whole ridden body laying limply on the ground. Slowly, they began to inch forward, leaving trails of blood in their wake until they saw her. Matriarch Valeria walked forward in a daze. Her senses were sharp and strong, and the aura she was radiating was so powerful that Silas knew that even if she just stood there without any defenses at all, he would have a hard time even harming a hair on her head. But he had no plans on even trying to. He just squeezed by, struggling all the way. He only turned back once, just to see Matriarch Valeria absent-mindedly walking through the trails of blood, her body soaking it up as she acted no differently from how the seeing thorn would. In fact, by now, the blood and flesh at the locations Gogo had just been were probably long gone. Perfect timing, indeed. As for what Silas' plans were, it was likely only he knew. Chapter 11:16. Enough. Matriarch Valeria rushed into the hall to find it in complete and utter chaos. It could be said that in the history of this Petals of the Seeing Thorn branch, this was the worst event to ever happen. Honestly, the matriarch was flawed. Just what had been protecting that little girl that it could cause this much carnage? She wanted to blame Sorantha for giving her poor information, but there wasn't an ounce of the matriarch that believed her daughter would make such a rudimentary mistake. There was no way she would mistake an F grade for something else. It was well within Sorantha's capabilities to see through at least that tier. Unless there was a treasure to hide tier that Matriarch Valeria wasn't aware of or familiar with, that snake was most definitely an F-grade existence. But it was also quick and efficient and had somehow skated by all of her most powerful warriors. No, that wasn't true. There was one who had died. Lise had died so quickly that there was no report that could be given. That made Matriarch Valeria believe that this snake was even stronger than what it had already displayed. But, where was it? Matriarch Valeria spread her senses out and turned silent when she felt nothing at all. Gone. That was impossible. There was. Matriarch Valeria's head snapped back to the maze as she thought of the one and only way that could have happened. But that was impossible too. That snake didn't have their unique gene. How? Her eyes opened wide. Somehow, Nosfaline had made it in here with the snake. Who was to say that she couldn't make it out? Sorantha claimed that Nosfaline was almost certainly dead, but the matriarch knew how tricky it was to nail down such things. This was trouble, a lot of trouble. Had Nosfaline just been a normal woman, it would be fine. But the rules of the Petals of the Seeing Thorn. Damn it. The matriarch's greatest regret was that she hadn't been able to raise an heiress with her talent. Sorantha seemed like a shocking genius, but she was just one titan of one generation, and not even at the top of the list either. With how long the matriarch had lived, how many iterations of the Titan's leaderboard had she seen? How many Soranthas were there? There was at least one a decade. But while Sorantha had decent enough talent, she was too ambitious. Ambition wasn't a problem normally. It became one when that ambition was overblown in comparison to one's actual abilities. She was constantly chasing levels she couldn't reach, and that made her miss opportunities that were right in front of her. Now all of that had boiled over into her finally taking a chance on something, but it was a chance that would put everything the Valeria clan had ever built in great jeopardy. And then there was her younger daughter. Nissa was smarter than Sorantha, in the matriarch's opinion. She was sharper, better at taking small advantages, and as disdainful as Sorantha was of her little sister. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of Nissas in their clan, but only Nissa herself had managed to reach her current standing. Personality-wise, if not for the inferiority complex that came from being constantly suppressed beneath her sister, Nissa was actually far more like the matriarch than Sorantha was. If only she could fuse her two daughters together. If only. And now, this mess had been placed at her feet. What to do? What direction to take? The matriarch closed her eyes for a moment, the scent of blood hanging in the air assaulting her senses. But it didn't seem to bother her nearly as much as everything else. What she cared most about was whether or not she would be able to maintain control of her power. She had felt like she was being schemed against already, and she could feel it in the very depths of her bones that this was true. Right now, she felt like the trap was closing in and she was running out of time to make a decision, but there were too many variables and too little she knew. Taking a step, the matriarch vanished. Sorantha froze when her mother suddenly appeared before her. Although Nissa was barely over 5 feet tall, the matriarch herself was a truly towering woman, standing at over 6 feet 2 inches even without her heels. With them, she stood as tall as 6 feet 8 inches without the slightest hint of instability. "Show me." Sorantha shivered, and because of the fear, it took her a small while to understand what it was her mother was saying. But soon enough, she grasped it. Closing her eyes, she pulled on what she felt was the true chosen mark, and soon it was pulsing around her forehead. Seeing this, the matriarch relaxed a bit. It was the real mark. This was what she was most worried about. If her daughter's eyes had been fooled, then this would be entirely unsalvageable. After doing this, she ignored her daughter for a moment and looked at the Titans leaderboard. Sky Galaxy Titans leaderboard. 1. Zorix Chi Alpha, LV, 50, Thriskai. 2. Thalric Dazath, LV, 50, Trakar. 3. Zalasra Chi Alpha, LV, 50, Thriskai. 4. Sorantha Valeria, LV, 50, Florinath. Indeed, he's gone. Explain your thoughts to me. Matriarch, from what I could tell, the woman that came here is likely from Scylla's Grimblade's summoned world. Why do you think this? Because she hails from a race I have never seen before, and she has the true chosen mark. That is all. I believe that is enough. Those two can prove everything. Explain. The simplest answer is probably the most correct one. Scylla's Grimblade suddenly disappeared a week or so ago, and his whereabouts were entirely unknown until he suddenly appeared again recently, only to vanish once more. If I had to make a guess, a world that can produce Scylla's Grimblade is likely to produce more than just one substantial talent. Chapter 11:17. Detection. Sorantha poured out her thoughts in an almost cascading storm, but she tried to remain as coherent as she could. The odds that one such talent would arise from a world is minimal. It's far more likely that this world is quite talented to begin with, and that is probably why the recent announcements about the upgrade to the galaxy were triggered. Explain. It's my belief that Scylla's Grimblade's summoned world is very high in grade, higher than any other world in our galaxy. As such, its successful summoning was able to elevate us all. By extension, it makes sense that they would produce more than just one talented race. That is still not enough. Yes, I understand, but the second piece of it is the existence of the true chosen mark. As you know, Matriarch, only 3 true chosen marks were given out, but the luck of our galaxy was spread across many more than just that. I was quite close to receiving a mark myself, and as such, I was given a good portion of luck as well. Because of that, my senses toward the true chosen mark are stronger than most. I could feel the existence of the mark vaguely while observing Nosphaline Tideborn's race through the trial, but it wasn't until I saw her personally that I could confirm that I was, indeed, sensing correctly. But I could also feel something else. The luck around Nosphaline Tideborn was only recently changed, very recently. As you know, Matriarch, Overlord race status is also heavily tied to luck, and from what I could tell, the woman also only became a member very recently as well. Matriarch Valeria's eyes narrowed. Continue. This was the final puzzle piece I needed. As far as we can tell, Scylla's Grimblade is just a normal human, and a world will only pick one Overlord race. If I'm correct, Scylla's Grimblade is of the current Overlord race of his summoned world, while this girl was from a previous race. Matriarch has likely read about many case studies like this. A world always favors the first races it produces more than the latter ones. Although Silas Grimblade led his summoned world to a successful ascension, it's likely older races continued to exist and have been plotting to overthrow him. With how much Silas Grimblade has been overextending himself in the outside world, it isn't impossible that such a race could grab onto a weakness of his and take advantage of it. It doesn't even have to be so detailed, maybe they simply sprung a trap and managed to snatch away the true chosen mark for themselves. And of course, Silas Grimblade's disappearance from the Titans leaderboard is likely the final confirmation. Silence fell between the mother-daughter pair. The logic was sound, the story was compelling, but there simply wasn't nearly enough information. The matriarch could practically feel her daughter cutting corners just to force the story to be accurate, just to allow herself the right to maintain the true chosen mark. But in the end, hadn't she been correct about at least one thing? That was most definitely the true chosen mark. There was no getting around that. It was definitely real. In that case, even if the story was only 70 or 80% accurate, the end result was true enough. Plus, no matter how the matriarch racked her brain, there was simply no way Silas Grimblade could just disappear from the leaderboard. No, there was one way he could do that. By progressing to the E grade. And that one caveat, that one little seed of doubt, was why the matriarch still felt like everything was not yet fully under her control. Quote ellipsis, we will trigger a seeing thorn sanctum. We will contact the main branch and inform them of the changes here, and they will decide how they want to move forward. You will let me do all of the talking, and you will stand there obediently. Understood, matriarch. A light lit in Sorantha's eyes. This was it, this would be her chance. So long as they kept things under wraps, if they started leveraging the true power of the petals of the seeing thorn, wouldn't everything come up roses? The matriarch looked at her daughter through the corners of her eyes as she led the way out, the disappointment in her heart only growing. Sorantha liked to think that she was the only intelligent person in the room. But if she could pick up on so many clues, how could others not start raising eyebrows? Silas' disappearance from the list and the largest commotion in Petals of the Seeing Thorn history all taking place on the same exact day. Was that really such a coincidence? It was such a simple deduction too, but Sorantha was so obsessed with her chance to break through to a new realm of talent in the near future that she was letting her excitement blind her. It was simply unacceptable. The duo stepped into a room deep within the organization. It had the dim, soothing light of a greenhouse, and its walls were lined with greenery and flowers. At the center of it all, there was an altar. Contacting the main branch, or rather, at least their overseeing branch, wasn't difficult. It just cost quite a sum of money, not to mention that there would be sanctions if there wasn't a very good reason. But there was one thing that Sorantha had said that the matriarch could use. The elevation of the galaxy to a much higher silver grade would quickly make it a hot commodity. This would mean the Petals of the Seeing Thorn would be much more likely to invest, especially if they would soon have the progenitor of this galaxy. If Sorantha could follow through and make things right. Matriarch Valeria took a breath and began to activate the altar, a pulsing might sweeping out as a tunneling connection was formed between this galaxy and one across the vast cosmos. But then the situation changed. Violation detected. Violation detected. Violation detected. Violation detected. Violation detected. Matriarch Valeria froze in place. Chapter 11:18. Sanction. Cise Valeria, 541st Head of Seeing Thorn Branch 01113. Vines from the surroundings shot forward, and Cise didn't even resist, not that she could. She had been ready and prepping for the absolute worst, but even she hadn't expected things to suddenly flip on their heads like this. Even though she tried to remain calm, it was an impossible task when she could feel that her life could be ripped out of her at any moment. Sorantha's eyes opened wide, and she was in too much shock and fear to even move. Matriarch. Don't move, Cise said coldly, her ire toward her daughter practically being tempered into her being akin to hot steel at this point. She knew this was a trap of some sort from the beginning, she just had no idea what could have possibly triggered it, or even what the purpose of it was. It just didn't make any sense. What could someone gain by doing this? Giving up a true chosen mark just for the sake of killing her? She wasn't even participating in all of this to begin with. It was ridiculous. Her gut kept telling her that something was wrong, but all of her logic pointed to it all being just fine. Under normal circumstances, she would have just stopped things before they went too far. But because her daughter went ahead and got the ball rolling all on her own, she had already reached the point of no return. There was simply no going back, even if she wanted to. And now, it felt like everything was over. No matter what plans these enemies in the dark had, they were laid out right here, and there was simply no chance of changing it now. Her life was no longer in her own hands. But when the matriarch saw the code she had supposedly violated, her eyes opened wide and she shuddered from head to toe. Monster. She was facing off against a monster. You have been sanctioned, pending trial. S-Class sanction applied. S-Class sanction. There were only a handful of things that could trigger something like that. And after going through them all, the matriarch knew exactly which one it was. Her face drained of all color. There was simply no way out of this. Not a single way. Silas gasped for breath, his body in aching agony and yet not having nearly the healing factor it needed to recover as fast as he would like. Luckily, amongst the things he had taken from the Golden Grove, high-class healing elixirs were definitely among them. He didn't want to use them too often because they were very valuable, and as far as he could tell, all of them put great stress on the body. But he had no choice at this point. Silas had learned many things during his research and study. Among them, he had taken a deep dive into the alchemy world of rune masters as well, and he had more knowledge about elixirs now than ever before. There was a good reason that elixirs, especially healing ones, scaled based on your stats. They were drawing on your own body's strength to fuel them. The stronger the elixir, then, the more of this draw occurred. That was also why elixirs couldn't just be pounded one after another, and there was a cooldown period before you could use them again. Elixirs that provided all the healing strength themselves theoretically existed, but they were only spoken about in vague generalities in the Golden Grove's information stores. As far as Silas could tell, this section of the universe didn't have them, likely because the rune masters here were too inferior to create them. From his educated guesses, the reason these lower-tier elixirs were so limited was because the rune mastery behind them was too poor. The human body, or any living body, for that matter, was formed from genes drawn to beyond spark mastery. Healing it thus required relying on that perfection, otherwise what filled it in would just be cancerous slop. Theoretically, though, if you could draw healing elixir runes to the same level of mastery your body was at, then you wouldn't need to draw on your body's potential to heal yourself. You could just get the healing done through the elixir's energy alone. These were all just speculations on Silas' part, of course. He doubted it needed to be so complex, but the logic was still mostly sound. Boom. A pillar of light shot into the air as Silas drifted in his vessel. That pillar without a doubt came from a certain petals of the Seeing Thorn branch, no doubt. Silas couldn't help but slightly relax. He knew that he had succeeded. The Seeing Thorn. It was a treasure of the information organization, and it was a very precious commodity. One had to think, though, why would the petals of the Seeing Thorn be so careless with who they gave it to? How could even a small branch like this one have a B-grade race protecting it? The truth was that despite its strength, the Seeing Thorn could be easily mass-produced. In fact, just a small piece of the Seeing Thorn could grow out an entirely new one. One might wonder, then, why this creature wasn't the overlord of this entire sector, then. And that was, 1, because of the very strict rules of the organization, and 2, because the Seeing Thorn was obviously not invincible. It had its weaknesses. But much the same way it had its weaknesses, it had its shocking strengths as well. The Seeing Thorn's ability to absorb, even to the point of suppressing and overwhelming a world's core, was obviously very enticing. Many in the past had done the best to try and take advantage of this, so much so that the petals of the Seeing Thorn had no choice but to stop this. And that was because it had been taken too far. More shockingly, the secrets behind this involved the petals of the Seeing Thorn. And the professors of legacy. Chapter 11:19. Taboo. The purpose of legacy was almost a mirror to the petals of the Seeing Thorn. The latter was obsessed with gathering information about people, politics, the sort of information that could bring the patriarch of a powerful family or organization to their knees. The former, however, only cared for improvement. When Legacy saw that the petals of the seeing thorn had such a trump card, they obviously wanted to study it. How had this rare plant been culled and controlled, even turned into a weapon in the defense of the organization? Once Legacy was interested in something, they would definitely take action. But Legacy was also not a confrontational organization. They chose their spots and only acted when it wouldn't offend or step on toes they couldn't afford to step on. Of course, the depths of Legacy ran far deeper than most could fathom. But soft power was far more useful when dealing with so many powers than hard power was. Legacy often rode a line that pissed off many. If they had to deal with all of their potential enemies at once, even they would suffer. This was seen quite recently. Though it was the system that bit back this time, it was because Legacy took the risk in the first place. That said, Legacy was one thing. The professors were a different matter entirely. They, a faction of Legacy, didn't ride a line at all. They were far more aggressive, and far more willing to take risks. They were madmen that only danced between the line of life and death. The only thing they were interested in was improvement no matter what the cost was, even if they had to turn themselves into a science project. This was exactly why the seeing thorn was so enticing to them. So they found their own methods of infiltrating the petals of the seeing thorn. Originally, the seeing thorn was a sacred being to the organization, an idol to be worshipped and respected for its help, and never taken advantage of. This was a rule that was set by the very first seeing thorn's matriarch. However, after the fallout of the professor's efforts, leading to a complete wipe of not just one galaxy, but an entire sector of its life, the petals of the seeing thorn had to spend many generations recovering their reputation. What led to such a result? The professors figured out something quite shocking. Using the unique gene of the seeing thorn, they were able to borrow its abilities, making use of the seeing thorn to absorb genes, blood essence, and even deeper layer talents in ways they had never imagined possible in the past. It was an intoxicating method of improvement. But what the professors and their collaborators didn't notice quickly enough was that this mode of improvement came with its own drawbacks. Evolution had its own checks and balances. The seeing thorn was an incredibly powerful race, but they lacked intelligence. There were plant races out there that were no less intelligent than humanoid races, but the seeing thorn was not one of them. When one began to rely on the seeing thorn for this method of improvement, it would crush you. Not physically, but mentally. What made you you? It would slowly be whittled away. The more you relied on it, the less of you would remain until you were a mindless zombie after much the same things as the seeing thorn. In fact, this was precisely why when one entered the maze, they lost consciousness. For the professors, who were already so obsessed with improvement, they didn't see the problem with this until it was too late. The details of what happened afterward were lost to time. And honestly, even these details were mostly lost to Silas. He didn't have the full scope of the picture when he deduced these matters. What he did know were a few things, though. First, he knew that the petals of the seeing thorn had a very protective relationship with their seeing thorn. The Golden Grove didn't have much information on them, ironically enough, but it was enough to know this. Second, he knew that the seeing thorn was a B-grade race, and that immediately raised alarm bells to him, especially after he learned that plant races could build civilizations no less complex and magical than humanoids could. Third, he had had the chance to observe Nissa's unique gene ahead of time. Silas couldn't take out a person's gene when they were alive. The only exception to this had been the clandestine ape, who had a unique physique he could take advantage of. However, it was a different matter entirely when the lust seed was involved, especially if Nissa didn't resist. In this case, he didn't need to kill her at all. Sila's ability to understand runes was only improving by leaps and bounds every day. And during his 6-month stint, suffering day after day to become a D-grade human semioid, he had nothing else to do between the pain other than hone exactly that. While he hadn't learned any new runes, nor had he grasped any new unique concepts, his understanding and refinement of the fundamentals were on another level now more than ever before. At this point, he understood his own genes like the back of his hand, and that helped him to analyze Nissa's seeing thorn gene with much greater ease. Thanks to this, he was able to deduce exactly how the connection worked, and that helped him to do several things. First, he knew that semi-fusion would work so long as Nosfaline managed to get the unique gene. Second, he knew that when in a dazed state and consciousness was lost, this was the state where anyone inside the maze was the most in tune with the seeing thorn. And third, he knew that when these two things came together, framing Matriarch Valeria for breaking the greatest taboo of the petals of the seeing thorn would be a matter of great ease. Yet, this was still just the tip of the iceberg of Scylla's plan. That was because he knew the organization would let Matriarch Valeria live this time. And it was what they did after that would give him exactly the opportunity he needed to end all of this. Matriarch Valeria felt the vines constricting her, the thorns piercing into her soft flesh. Slowly, a figure began to shimmer into existence across from her. Chapter 11:20. Speak. Matriarch Valeria was doing her best not to tremble from head to toe right now, but though her daughter couldn't feel what was happening, she could feel it all too clearly. This was someone powerful. This was AC grade. This was the only sort of existence they could possibly send for something like this. No, it wasn't that AC grade was necessary to deal with the likes of Matriarch Valeria, but it just went to show how great a line she had somehow crossed. If not for the fact that this was such a taboo, any D grade from a more established branch would have been able to deal with her. But it was the sight she saw as this figure became more solid that well and truly shook her to her core. Those black eyes, without distinction between sclera and irises. That hand, almost dry to the touch, thin and brittle as straws, yet as dark as the night itself. That pale skin, almost to the point of sickliness, and those faintly grayed and blackened veins that pulsed across her body. Matriarch Valeria wasn't someone who could be said to be widely knowledgeable about the great scope of things throughout the universe, but she was better than most. She was the head of an information network, after all, even if it was just a branch. There were certain things she was privy to that others wouldn't know. And she knew how to fear this woman. The Venom clan. The woman solidified, and it felt like the world had suddenly come to the verge of crumbling. It wasn't that her aura was just so powerful, but instead that her presence itself was like a cancer to the runes that formed the foundation of existence. Her every movement, her every touch, her every slight shift was like another pulse of poison into the world, peeling away at its layers and forcing it into a state of perpetual decay. And then she turned that gaze to Matriarch Valeria. The matriarch wanted to scream, her insides beginning to churn and her will itself peeling away much like the layers of the world. Everything felt like it was slipping away. Not too far away, Sorrentha trembled from head to toe, wanting to say something, but not having the strength or fortitude to do so. Even if she somehow picked up the courage to say something, the pressure would probably kill her immediately. The Venom clan woman turned to Sorrentha, and then her head slowly tilted to the side. Veins in her forehead flickered and split to form a second pair of eyes, and then a third pair, each one just as dark as the first. Matriarch Valeria's shuddering became more prominent when she saw this. This was no normal member of the Venom clan. This was a true monster of the clan. This was more serious than she had thought, more serious by measures she couldn't even fathom. "What is this?" she spoke in an almost gravelly voice. If not for the pitch, it would have been hard to fathom that it came from a woman at all. She seemed genuinely confused as she looked to Sorrentha, not understanding why such an inferior woman and talent would have so much luck concentrated onto her. Then she sensed the state of the overall galaxy and became even more confused. Why did the system feel so far away here, and yet so present at the same time? She could tell that if she tried to ignore one of the rules of the system right this moment, she would suffer for it. It would most definitely descend. So why did it feel so broken at the same time? The Venom clan woman looked toward Matriarch Valeria again, suddenly feeling that there was more to the story. This had to be the case, because according to the rewinding of events here, the report she had been given on how the matriarch was exposed, it didn't make much sense either. The matriarch had been exposed by trying to contact them. Logically, that meant that though the taboo was most definitely broken, it wasn't to an egregious degree, nor did it reach a threshold where other failsafes would trigger. Despite these thoughts, the aggressiveness of the woman didn't fade completely. This was a taboo for a reason. It couldn't just be casually swept under the rug. "I asked a question," she said coldly. Rather than looking at the matriarch, though, she was looking at Sorrentha. Sorrentha suddenly found that she had regained the ability to speak, but she also didn't have the words to say. She didn't even know what was going on. "Speak." The words flooded out of Sorrentha before she could stop them. She even said things that she had no intention of saying, even going as far as admitting that she had killed Nosfaline for the true chosen mark. She felt horrified as she was speaking, but there was nothing she could do to stop it no matter how hard she tried. The gap between her will and that of the Venom clan woman was so vast that there wasn't even a chance for her to resist. There was no need for a special technique or method, she was simply squeezed until her consciousness had nothing left to do but pour out what it had been asked. I see, the woman said calmly. Not a single word Sorantha spoke had to do with her mother's taboo, which at the very least meant that none of these things had spread. Speak. Matriarch Valeria's suppression weakened just the slightest bit. Your esteemed Venom clan noble, I cannot say much about these matters because I do not understand them. I understand what taboo I have crossed, but I have no explanation for how. Is that so? So here, there is a daughter that flouts the rules of my petals of the seeing thorn for the sake of her own personal gain, and a mother who has clearly done the same but has no recollection. Bang! Both Sorantha and the matriarch fell to their knees so heavily that their legs fractured to near pieces. This concludes the chapters for today. To continue the journey, be sure to find the next chapters on our channel. If you're excited about this story as we are, please like this video and subscribe. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on this chapters.